For those of you who have already logged in, thanks so much for your prompt attendance. I'd like to thank you and welcome you to our first Sea Change webinar. As we can see, it looks like, actually maybe I'm the only person who may be able to see it now, but we have a number of participants from across the globe, and it looks like we have some participants in Kenya and the UK in addition to our colleagues who are in Southeast Asia. So thanks so much for coming and joining us today. My name is Saria Sok. I'm the team leader for the Sea Change Community of Practice. I'd like to take a moment to outline our session today. First, I'll give a brief introduction on the Sea Change Community of Practice, and Kurt, our community sponsor, will brief you on a short history. Next, we'll move on to the featured presentation, which will be followed by a question and answer session. And I'd like to remind participants, if you're unfamiliar with this the software, you may use the raised hand icon or write your questions into the question pane, and we will call on you so that you may ask your question to Meg, our presenter. And then within the hour, we will wrap up the webinar. And for those who are not familiar with Sea Change, we are a newly formed COP. We are officially the community of practice for monitoring and evaluation of climate change interventions in Southeast Asia. Our members are made up of M&E practitioners who are experienced in climate change projects, as well as climate change program staff, consultants, and experts who are interested in advancing the M&E systems in their work. And as we know, measurements, assessments, and M&E in general are important aspects of our work in development, but in fact it's the central focus of Sea Change. Changes in the climate have significantly shaped and reframed our development, and more specifically sustained development as we know it. Sea Change is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and supported by PACT. Our community of practice is pioneering this exciting initiative that brings together M&E and climate change. Our community of practice is now just over 30 members strong, and we have some supportive members who are also all over the globe. We have a few supportive members in South Asia, North America, and Africa. And right now, I'll turn the mic over to Kurt, who will give you a brief history of Sea Change. Kurt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Saria. Can everybody hear me, or can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. The initial core members of the community of practice came together in an event in New Delhi last October, where we began mapping out the role of the community of practice and started formulating the Sea Change goal statement. The goal statement that we came up with is that we develop a culture of high quality and rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches, and methodologies for climate change interventions and practices in Southeast Asia. As Saria mentioned, my name is Kurt McLeod. I'm honored to be the community sponsor for Sea Change. Members of the community practice hope to achieve this goal through several objectives. The first objective is fostering partnerships and building community capacity for strengthening discourses and practices on monitoring and evaluation in climate change. Second, sharing best practices, lessons learned, guidelines, approaches, methods, tools, and innovations to improve monitoring and evaluation practices. And third, influencing policy and practice around the monitoring and evaluation of climate change interventions. As you're experiencing today, hosting webinars is one of the primary Sea Change activities that we hope will bring together members to learn, exchange, and connect through these online seminars. With this particular webinar, we are happy that we're kicking off a series of webinars that will feature monitoring and evaluation frameworks, approaches, and tools that are adapted and implemented specifically in the climate change context.
Thank you, Kurt. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter. We're very pleased to have Meg Spearman from the World Resource Institute. Meg will share with us Sorry, just a quick moment. If you have any troubles hearing, please bear with us. We're new to this technology and appreciate your patience. I'm sorry. As I was saying, we're happy to have Meg join us today and present a much anticipated practitioner's guide in a presentation entitled Making Adaptation Count, Concepts and Options for Climate Change Adaptation, Monitoring, and Evaluation. This practitioner's guide was developed in partnership with GIZ and with funding by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Meg is an associate in the Vulnerability and Adaptation team, which works under the WRI Climate Change and Energy program. She comes to WRI after 3 years of working primarily on climate change mitigation ex post evaluation with the GEF office, that is the Global Environment Facilities Evaluation Office. She's also had experience in short-term consultancies with the World Bank and also work in the private sector. Meg is most interested in the intersections between effective aid development and climate change mitigation and adaptation, but specifically the use of monitoring and evaluation as a tool for aligning intentions with results. So as you'll see, the WRI framework is one example we'll be sharing with you in our webinar series. We hope that the introduction to the practitioner's guide will spark a lively discussion. And again, we ask that participants please save your questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar, which will follow the presentation. And with that, and without further ado, actually, I present you Meg.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, excellent. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I'm very happy to be here. This has been a long project since August to develop this publication that will be coming out in about a month. And it's very exciting to have this chance to speak with this community of practice through Sea Change and really sort of prompt good discussion on this topic, which I think everyone knows is very complex. The title of the upcoming publication is Making Adaptation Count, Concepts and Options for Climate Change Adaptation, Monitoring, and Evaluation. And as Saria had mentioned, it's been a project done in partnership with GIZ, which they just changed their name from GTZ, and funded through the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development of the government of Germany. And without further ado, move on to the contents. If there's a pause in my speech, it's because my computer is not cooperating, so I apologize in advance. And right now is one of those moments. Okay, so the contents of the presentation today. First, I'm going to have a brief introduction about the purpose behind this project that we've undertaken. I'm going to go through a number of concepts that we cover in this upcoming publication on the intersections between development and adaptation and M&E. Next, I'm going to walk through a number of steps that help practitioners develop an M&E system for an adaptation intervention or a development intervention with adaptation components. And the options part of our title really comes into play in our publication because as you go through these steps, it explores the various options in approaching that particular step to developing the M&E system. And then finally I'll end. So the questions that we sought to answer in this forthcoming guide were, what are the needs and uses of M&E for climate change adaptation? What is the effectiveness criteria for climate change adaptation? And what is the state of the art? Who's doing what? Secondly, this publication is intended primarily for development practitioners who are beginning to explore adaptation and or M&E. For adaptation specialists who maybe are interested in learning more about M&E or need to work on developing frameworks for their particular interventions. And finally, at sort of a policy level or a strategic level, programmatic level, it's also of interest possibly to funders of adaptation interventions. The bottom line here, though, is that one size does not fit all for M&E in adaptation. It's a very diverse field, and it's very context-specific, as we know, and it's important to understand that tailoring particular frameworks is extremely important to finding a useful approach to M&E in any given adaptation intervention. So, to go through a few of the challenges to doing M&E for adaptation, one of the big challenges is the fact that the past is not necessarily a guide to the future. There's a lot of uncertainty involved in climate change adaptation right now. And this can be scientific, it might be political, it might be financial. Secondly, as we know, it has very complex relationships with the ideas of sustainability and development, and with poverty and poverty reduction. It's very cross-sectoral and interdisciplinary. And it's associated with long time frames and a very diverse definition of measuring effectiveness. And lastly, there's an absence of counterfactuals with which to measure our results in many regards. So therefore, monitoring and evaluation for adaptation needs to support local ownership. It needs to foster learning and adaptive management and ensure a full range and depth of stakeholder involvement. But it also needs to meet the needs of results-based management through aid effectiveness and be relevant to users and funders, and also flexible given all the many uncertainties. So we found that there were two primary reasons why M&E is important for adaptation. And one is to provide critical support to the long-term process of learning what works in adaptation. We don't know this yet. There was a recent blog, for example, on the Overseas Development Institute where they asked, are we jumping the gun on M&E for adaptation? And I think most of us would say yes, but we still need to try. So understanding how the intervention influences and is influenced by context, what contributes to autonomous adaptation or even maybe maladaptation, evidence of historical coping mechanisms, acceptable social or economic levels of risk, and developing strategies to current and future climate change. And secondly, to provide a powerful tool to help practitioners manage their work. M&E helps practitioners reach their objectives, adjust activities, be flexible, to be able to compare results in different contexts or similar contexts in different regions, and it helps people prompt discussion. Even across all these various ways of approaching M&E for adaptation, we found that there's some fairly consistent tensions in the way the M&E systems are shaped. And we've highlighted four here. The purpose of M&E is there's a tension between learning and accountability. Learning can mean failing, and that's part of the learning process, whereas accountability really means you're being held to a certain standard, and those two can conflict. Secondly, the definition of effective adaptation. Adaptation inevitably is a process over time, but it also has iterative outcomes. And so choosing indicators, for example, can be a reflection of how you think about the adaptation process and or the kinds of results you hope to get out of that process. There's a natural tension there as well. The basis for the M&E system designs, as we know, monitoring and evaluation of adaptation has been an active field more recently, but work has gone back into the 90s at least. And there's lots of tried and tested methodologies pulled from very practical approaches to agriculture, for example, and or other fields in development. But there's also a lot of conceptual models and thinking coming out more recently, which may be untested but might be useful in the context of adaptation. And then finally, the ownership of monitoring and evaluation. There's a sort of a bottom-up and a top-down tension. Participatory M&E, for example, is not always participatorily conducted. So you have this tension between sort of bottom-up decision-making and interests, and then sort of a top-down policy look. And when you're lucky, you can find that they meet in the middle, but often there's a natural leaning towards one ownership of one than the other. So we reviewed, we did a desk review of different types of adaptation efforts. And we found that there are three basic categories where there's a very different set of needs and uses of how M&E is conducted. And one is community-based, one is in the sphere of national policies, and finally program and project-based efforts, which have largely come out of development cooperation. But even across these different efforts, there's some early lessons on adaptation monitoring evaluation. And those are, firstly, that adaptation depends heavily on context. Benefits are very localized, and what might be adaptation in one context could very well be maladaptation in another. Secondly, diversity contributes to adaptation-relevant M&E systems. It's really important to understand that the robustness of the system relies heavily on having redundancies and having a wide variety of options, even in the face of many uncertainties, and that actually helps the M&E system and it helps adaptation. And finally, assumptions are very important in this context of uncertainty, and being clear about assumptions, whether or not they're correct, is not really important. The idea that you understand your basis of decision making, on the other hand, is. So we've come up with three principles for adaptation M&E, and that is results-based management, learning, and flexibility. And the next section I'm going into explains how you can use these three concepts to follow steps to form an adaptation-relevant M&E system. First step is to describe the adaptation context. Second is to identify the contribution to adaptation. Third is to form an adaptation hypothesis. Fourth is to create an adaptation theory of change. Fifth, choose indicators and set baseline. And then finally, use the adaptation M&E system. Now these steps were designed to be flexible as well. They look very linear here, but people are going to come across these steps at different stages in their planning, and so they might find it very useful to focus in on one. They might find one or two irrelevant, or they might want to skip around and go to different sections or look at different options. For example, we have a number of annexes in the publication. The first step is to describe the adaptation context. And this primarily comprises of a risk or vulnerability assessment and understanding who or what is vulnerable or at risk. To what degree? How likely is it? By when? So you can see there's a little box here that's an example of an Oxfam project in Ethiopia, where you can see that the rainfall has remained primarily constant over the past 50 years, but there's increased variability. The anticipated climate conditions for the near future is that total rainfall will drop in some regions, but overall there will be overall increased variability. And in the particular site of the intervention, there's an overall loss of biomass expected and an increased incident of drought over the next 20 or 30 years. And then the analysis from the vulnerability assessment is that the pastoralists are more affected, women are disproportionately also more affected, and that rainfall is in fact not always the key reason why crops fail, for example. There are other factors involved. So this risk or vulnerability assessment can be helpful for identifying socially acceptable levels of risk, opportunities, for identifying determinants of resilience or coping mechanisms. And it can help you find indicators that feed into sectoral, state, or national planning, and of course help you form a baseline and identify gaps in information, nonlinearities, and thresholds in particular climate effects. And lastly, it's a very important step to helping prioritize your actions. step 2 is to identify the contribution to adaptation. And what we mean here is adaptation as a process has been broken down in this framing into 3 parts or dimensions. And the first is adaptive capacity. So the important thing here is to ask whether your intervention is contributing to adaptive capacity, and in what ways. So things that relate to preparedness or resources or capability would fall under adaptive capacity. Secondly is adaptive actions. And adaptive actions deal with the biophysical and the socioeconomic effects or vulnerability factors in light of climate change and climate variability. And these might relate to indicators that are environmental or physical or socioeconomic. And finally, sustained development in a changing climate. And we've picked this word sustained instead of sustainable because we don't just want it to be able to be sustained, we actually want it to be sustained. This is the sort of ultimate goal of the adaptation process, is to not diminish our ability to develop and to meet development needs. So the things that would fall under here would relate to economic or social well-being or human health or property, things like that. So this is a diagram of these 3 dimensions of the adaptation process. And you can see the supporting structure below helps you reach your sustained development goals. And underneath you have adaptive capacity and you have adaptive actions. In the middle, perpetuating this whole process and sort of pushing things outward to increase the capacity of all of these dimensions is learning. And then monitoring and evaluation provides this sort of iterative feedback loop where you stop and you pause and reflect on your results and your processes, and you learn from them. And we have our little spiral showing that it's a perpetual dynamic process. Finally, step 3 comes to an adaptation hypothesis. The idea here is that you really differentiate between doing a development project, for example, and an adaptation project by honing in on the particular risks or vulnerabilities that you're actually addressing in your intervention. So the adaptation hypothesis is a quick exercise that helps you sort of match up that particular set of risks or vulnerabilities that you're addressing with the way you are addressing them. And it's formulated at the outcome level. So for example here, you might have an objective under adaptive capacity to enhance the adaptive capacity of the local communities. And you might have areas of response that you choose to intervene. And in here, on this example, we have energy and we have livestock. So the adaptation hypothesis, for example, under energy, is that biomass-based energy production offers an alternative coping strategy for households vulnerable to climate change impacts in semi-arid areas. So it's linking immediately the vulnerable households in the semi-arid areas with the intervention intentions to address biomass energy as this coping strategy. So the next step is to create an adaptation theory of change. Once you have a sense of what it is you want to do with your intervention, you can sort of follow a stepwise process to see how you think the relationship between the different parts of your intervention fit together and how there's somewhat a causal link or a chain reaction or a way of going from your inputs all the way through to your ultimate impacts. And there are going to be things that fall within the purview or the realm of the intervention that you might have control over, and then there's certain things that are well beyond the influence of this theory and of the intervention. And that's what this diagram here is showing. This is from the Terra Africa Country Support Tool, which is a GEF project for land degradation. It's not actually adaptation, but it's highly relevant. So the theory of change helps you visualize your intervention or adaptation strategy. It helps you identify key steps that need to be achieved to reach your risk or vulnerability reduction. And it helps you highlight the underlying assumptions, as I mentioned before. And these assumptions are important because they help you understand the basis of your decision making at a specific point in time, of which you can compare to later. It also reflects values, current values at the time, and it helps to identify evaluation questions later on. So here's an example of a rural village, for example, where the intention of the intervention is to train the village farmers in soil and water conservation. So you would have funding, information, and technology and training going into this, and eventually the farmers would be trained, and if all goes well, you improve your soil quality and your water storage, and therefore you have improved capacity to maintain your crop yield during droughts, and new practices spread throughout the village and neighboring villages means that ultimately at a local level you've increased income and the quality of life. So just going through a number of key assumptions here, one might be that the local partners have adequate incentives to participate. Another might be that there are systems in place for fair allocation of resulting benefits from the improved soil quality and water storage. And lastly, income is spent on maladaptive, is not spent on maladaptive activities. And some of these assumptions, depending on the particular practitioner or organization, you might want to differentiate which ones you actually have control over in the intervention, which ones you actually can address, and which ones are entirely outside of the purview, outside of the control of the intervention. So if you sort of break this down into a log frame or a results chain, it would look like this with your inputs and your activities, your outputs, your primary outcome, your secondary outcome, which could also just be two outcomes depending on how you want to phrase it, and then finally your impact or your final outcome. Next, we look at the indicators. The second to last step is to choose your indicators and set your baseline. So this is the same diagram from before. The only difference is that we have two types of indicators under each of these three dimensions of the adaptation process, and they're examples. So under sustained development, for example, we have livelihoods and we have ecosystem services. Under adaptive capacity, we have institutional functions and assets. And under adaptive actions, we have climate hazards and drivers of vulnerability. And these indicators have been used in a number of adaptation interventions, and they've been identified as helpful for reaching long-term objectives and for being sensitive to factors that end up being adaptive or being helpful in adaptation efforts. So under adaptive capacity, I'm going to breeze through the next three slides because they're kind of loaded down with terminology, but these are just examples of ways that you could look at your indicators. You could approach your indicators under adaptive capacity. And one is assets, as I mentioned before, and this relates to social, cultural, economic, environmental, technological capital that can be used to help you adapt. And here's an example. Rangeland might be considered an asset in a particular context. And so an output level indicator might be that local land use committees are established, and the outcome of that, if the committees function and do their job well, then you'll have improved collective rangeland management practices. Secondly, we have institutional functions, and this is an approach developed by WRI for the National Adaptive Capacity Framework, and it asks, what are we able to do that can help us adapt? And it's been applied at a government level in a number of test countries, and a publication will be coming out soon actually on it. But some of these functions might be coordination, evaluation, risk reduction, communication, information and knowledge management. So in this instance, this is an example from Bolivia where the institutional function is evaluations, and output might be to have these mandates to consider climate risk with local development plans and other planning instruments. And an outcome of that would be that the methodologies and guidelines are available. So secondly, we have adaptive actions, and under this we have climate hazards, which would be a biophysical manifestation of climate change. An example would be flooding, and you might have non-structural flood management systems, and the flood protection for strategic and priority flood-prone areas would therefore be protected. And then we have drivers of vulnerability, which relates more to the socioeconomic aspects of vulnerability, but could also relate to environmental factors, for example. And here, a lack of crop variety was identified as a source of vulnerability for a particular region, and one of the outputs for this was that there would be at least two improved crop varieties, and that they're tested, and that the measures improve agricultural production. And then finally we have ecosystem services and livelihoods under sustained development. These are two fields that livelihoods has been applied in a number of community-based adaptation efforts extensively, and ecosystem services is a relatively newer area. But they're both sort of long-term systematic indicators. So here you might have a regulating and provisional service at the level of, for example, developing seawater fish farm for economic and educational purposes, but also it would protect at the outcome level, buffer the community from climate change risks. And then finally, under livelihoods, this is a livelihood is what you do with the assets you have, and how you use them and how they benefit you. So it's a very close link with assets under adaptive capacity. And here we have equity of social capital, for example, as an aspect of social capital that is important to adaptation. And an output level indicator might be something like representation of each group in the decision-making process. And finally, the participation in the decision-making process occurs. Since there is this strong tension between process and outcome, particularly in adaptation, this is just a quick chart here from the Europe Topic Center on air and climate change. And it just goes through the advantages and disadvantages of outcome and process-based indicators. I won't read everything here, but it does give you something to think about when you consider your effectiveness criteria in different situations, and really what's relevant to the context of the intervention. For example, if you're working on government policy, or you're working on an intervention that might feed into a sectoral assessment of some kind, you might be more inclined to work with outcome-based indicators because most other government policy objectives or targets are outcome-based. On the other hand, if you want to really focus on a bottom-up process of decision-making and you want the stakeholders to help define the indicators, then you might be inclined to choose a process-based indicator so that in order to meet the outcomes of your intervention. Finally, this is adapted largely from the Adaptation Fund Board. It's just a three-step process basically to setting your adaptation baseline, starting with a review and synthesis of existing information. This could be taken from your vulnerability of risk assessment. And it can include top-down and bottom-up sources of information. Like bottom-up might be household surveys, and top-down might be something like the policy context. Next, you would want to describe the policies and measures in place that influence the ability to manage climate variability. So the current situation and how people are coping with climate variability and known climate change, for example. And then thirdly is developing the baseline indicators, which takes into account the underlying historical trend. So you might look at 5 or 10 years or maybe 20 or 30 years, depending on the intervention and how large scale, for example, it is. And noting that the direction of the indicator is very important to reflect in your decision. And then finally, identifying which adaptive dimensions the baseline indicator addresses. So is your baseline actually helping to define the adaptive capacity? Is it looking at adaptive actions, or is it something more related, akin to development? And then finally, if you pull all this together, the last step is to use the M&E system. So this is one way of visualizing how you would pull all those steps together, where you have your adaptation, actually it should say adaptation dimensions. We have terminology, double terminology here, sorry. Adaptation components. So you have enhancing adaptive capacity under one broad objective level, and then you have taking adaptive actions, and you have sustaining development. And under each of those you would have at least one high-level major objective or impact. And not every intervention will have all three, but if you have one, it will undoubtedly have a different sort of set of hypotheses and set of indicators, because it's addressing a different objective, a different theory of change, for example. And then you have your outcome level adaptation hypotheses under each of these major overriding objectives. And then you have activity monitoring, so things leading up to your outputs or your deliverables. And you have outcome monitoring, things that are done with the things that you produce or that you put out as deliverables in the intervention. Again, this is a simplified version just for illustrative purposes. And then taking those indicators, you can have a monitoring matrix of some kind where you can take your indicators from your results framework or your theory of change, which might also account for sort of contextual factors. It might relate to your, maybe you want to monitor things that aren't directly indicators of performance, but maybe relate to factors that you identified in your assumptions, for example. And then you'd have a baseline value for every indicator, and you would note your data collection method, how you came to verify or monitor this information, the responsibilities, who is monitoring, is it the community, is it a third party, what is the management structure, and then next the resources, so the estimation of resources required and or committed to this effort, and then finally your assumptions, which some might also call them risks to sustainability or risks to results, and this helps you figure out what might affect your M&E collection and or the quality of the data. So finally, to close up, there's some conclusions on learning by doing. So the first one here is to really think outside the project box as much as possible. It's very easy to get caught up in the project cycle and frankly the bureaucracy of paperwork and to really have to meet those needs. But we're at a stage in adaptation now where a lot of things that are innovative and important to pay attention to are falling well outside this sort of project box. And it's important to acknowledge that and be part of that. Next, explore options for overcoming barriers to participation. Participatory monitoring and evaluation can be very expensive. It can be very time-consuming, and it can be costly in other ways. And it can also be difficult to do this dual role of learning and accountability together, and who is accountable to who, for example. So being willing to find ways to overcome those barriers to participation and a wide diversity of input is very important to adaptation. Linking M&E systems. So we have lots of climate data that is not accessible, and we have lots of unknowns even among the climate information we have, for example, and we have lots of monitoring systems and results frameworks developed through specific government ministries. For example, we have the Millennium Development Goals, which is another way of monitoring global well-being, human well-being, and oftentimes these various databases and sources of information are not aligned and or are not considered, and we have a lot of redundancy. So being able to hone in on these links and take those opportunities is very critical at this stage in monitoring and evaluation of adaptation. Next, promote experimentation. I mentioned before that we have this practical versus conceptual tension, and in a lot of cases following the rules means that you miss all the fun and all the innovation, and it can be a little frightening, but a lot of the times new methodologies, I mean every methodology at some point is new, so having the opportunity to explore these options at this stage in monitoring evaluation for adaptation is very critical. And then finally, face the tensions and the trade-offs openly. We know that they're there, so there's no reason to hide them. I think that there's a growing community of knowledge sharing and lessons learned, and we should continue on that route. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Saria, for inviting me to do this. Here are the three main websites: the World Resources Institute and GIZ and C-Change. And I hope you continue to continue this discussion online, and we will certainly keep you updated on when this publication is finally released. We're still in final editing right now, so thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Meg. We really are looking forward to the final publication. Thanks for the detailed introduction to the guide as well. That was very helpful. There's a number of points that you've raised that I imagine our participants will want to ask you about. So for now, let's transition to our question and answer portion of the webinar. Again, I do ask participants to use the raise hand icon or the question pane. In here, you may type in the questions that you have. It is most likely the easiest way to see the presentation. I'm sorry, the questions that you have related to the presentation itself. So with that, if everyone can refer to these icons here, please use those so that I can call on you to ask questions. And while you're doing that, actually, I'd like to ask Meg. One of the points that you raised in the conclusion was linking M&E systems. As you mentioned, there's a number of systems that have already been established. I'd like to hear a little bit more of how you would recommend how can we actually, what steps can we take to begin linking the various systems, and how can we get aligned?
Oh, that's a big question. It's a very good question. I think it would be something that would come into very early in your planning process, and because inevitably when you do your risk or your vulnerability assessment to understand what specific climate factors you're addressing, you're going to need to review previous efforts, and you're going to need to review who's monitoring what to begin with. And in that context, then you'll learn very quickly, sort of maybe, hopefully, if there are duplicate efforts, or if actually something you do might support some other system down the line. And I think that would probably be the most likely place where you would find those links initially. Obviously, if you're doing something relating to government or policy making, you're going to look more into ministries or into the relevant government committees, for example, doing decision making in climate change, and what sorts of information are they gathering and why. And then I would say that's maybe the beginning of the process. At the other end, I find that, at least in evaluation, a lot of evaluations die a sad death. They're basically written, and then I'm not sure who reads them. So I feel like it would be very helpful to sort of increase the accessibility and the knowledge of of what findings we already have from evaluations and who has already done what work. And I feel like, for example, the adaptation learning mechanism and the Sea Change website and other sites where you're sort of doing this exchange, you can begin to see how to link those dots.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you. I think that's very helpful. That's not to provide a shameless plug here, but that's actually one of the things we're hoping to do with Sea Change, to continue the dialogue and to connect across M&E systems that have already been established, at least specifically for this region. I do see a hand up from Linda Yar. Linda, are you with us? Hello, Linda, if you're there, would you please speak into your mic?
Yeah, that doesn't make sense because it's we're not below ground.
Hello, Linda?
The house is, and there's something, well...
I think Linda may be on a separate call now. I'm not sure if there are other questions that are in the audience. Please use the hand icon. I see a question from Kurt. Kurt, please.
Hi, Meg. This is Kurt. I was very interested in your autonomous adaptation concept, which I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, to mean these are sort of spontaneous adaptation that's happening at perhaps the community level, which we as development practitioners can often overlook and plow over. What type of monitoring and evaluation systems do you think could be in place in order for us not just to be measuring our own theory of change, but perhaps be able to catch some of these autonomous or spontaneous adaptation that's happening at the local level?
Hi, Kurt. I didn't know that was you in the beginning. Now I know. Hi.
Hi.
That's a really excellent question, and I don't think I'll be able to do it justice, but it's something that I've thought of as part of this sort of early planning process when you're first deciding how it is you want to do your M&E system. I think that as an outsider in any community, for example, as you've given, it's really hard to know the historical trends and how people have responded to particular climate stresses, for example, in the past, and whether or not it worked. So I think that capturing those particular efforts that were not brought on by sort of outsiders or some policy level change or something, but were actually brought on by specific events or were proactive in some forms, has to be something that comes from really close observation and understanding the context as the community understands it. And things like, participatory action research, is a model, for example, for being really engaging with the community at a really practical level and seeing things the way they see it, as opposed to coming at it from an outside perspective. I can't think of any particular monitoring model that I've run across that was maybe ideal for understanding autonomous adaptation, but it is something I continue to pursue to look for. So if I find it, I will let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Next, Meg, we have a question from Karev. Karev, I see that you've typed in your question. Please speak into the mic if you'd like to ask the question directly to Meg. Karev, I'm not quite sure if perhaps you may have some audio issues. In that case, I'll go ahead and ask your question directly to Meg on your behalf. He writes, Meg, you mentioned that your upcoming publication also includes a review of the state of art in adaptation. Could you please describe your methodology considering the numerous projects that are labeled adaptation?
That's a good question. We initially went through we started actually with monitoring and evaluation tools and guidance, and that quickly expanded to sort of examining the M&E frameworks of adaptation programs, but also finding that there were other engaging communities of practice, for example, online, and ways of exchanging lessons learned that were also relevant to M&E of adaptation. And I think a lot of cynical practitioners would say that, you know, what we called water management one day, now we're calling it adaptation, or what we called sustainable agriculture yesterday, we're now calling it adaptation. And definitely, in a lot of regards, they're absolutely right, I think, and that there's the sense that we've shifted gears in terminology. But there's also another layer there that is clearly addressing things that development practitioners were not previously addressing. And the sort of state of play dimension of this practitioner's guide, we wanted it to be very useful. So we didn't give a long, comprehensive list of tools and programs and frameworks that anybody could theoretically throw together and not know the value of. We tried to find frameworks and tools and programs that actually addressed or spoke to the findings that we found through this research, and that in some way, shape, or form address some of the challenges or the principles outlined in the guidebook. So there's a huge table, for example, in the annexes that can kind of guide you through that. So I hope that helps answer your question. There's more detail in the paper, obviously.
Right, and we're looking for, and Meg, can you give us an idea of when you would expect the publication to be complete?
Well, it's probably going to go into a final copy edit next week, and then it will take, I think, around a month or more to produce at GIZ. So, you know, within the next month or two.
Mm-hmm. Great.
You'll be the first to know.
Thanks for that, Meg. Are there any other questions? We may have time, I think, for just one more. If there are any questions, please raise your hand. I see one from Edna. Edna, I'm going to turn on your mic. Please speak into your microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hello.
Hello, Edna.
Yeah, my question is actually following Kurt's question. Yes. Is there an evaluation framework that can be used in evaluate my...
Hello, Edna?
We had a research on farmer... Hello? So yeah, that's my question, because that was the issue that confronted me when we were having the research and so.
Meg? It sounds as though we may have some difficulties hearing Edna. Did you catch her question?
No, I caught the very beginning and then I missed the rest.
Okay, I heard a little bit of static as well. Luckily, she also used the question pane, and if it's all right with you, Edna, I'd like to go ahead and pose your question on your behalf. And actually, let's give it one more try. Hopefully, we'll have technology and the connectivity on our side. Edna, would you please ask your question at one more time?
Okay. So is there an evaluation framework or process that we can use that you know that we can use in evaluating autonomous spontaneous adaptation practices, particularly because this was an issue we have to resolve when we were evaluating adaptation practices of Southeast Asian smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Meg,
Hello?
yes,
Sorry?
Meg, did you catch that?
Oh, is she asking, I missed a little bit, but did she ask for an M&E framework for autonomous adaptation?
Yes, yes. In whole, her question is there an evaluation framework or process that you know of that can be used in evaluating autonomous or spontaneous adaptation?
I don't know of a particular one. I tried to answer this, I think, with Kurt's question, but I don't know of any particular one that has been devised, and I think it ends up being something that is very contextual and that unfortunately sort of lands as a burden on the program coordinator to map out a strategy at the intervention level. But I certainly will keep looking for them and keep thinking about this issue, and maybe we can continue this discussion on the Sea Change website, because I'm sure that Edna's not the only person. Obviously Kurt is interested as well in knowing how to do this.
Right, right. And that's a great reminder, Meg. Thanks so much. We will continue this discussion online on the Sea Change discussion forum. So for questions that were not addressed today, we do invite participants of the webinar today to visit our platform. With that, we'll wrap up the Q&A portion of our webinar and close our session for today. Thanks again, Meg, for a great presentation. I do believe that the Practitioner's Guide will help us reevaluate how we measure climate change adaptation efforts. And for a reminder to all who may not have heard the message earlier, but the presentation slides, in addition to the recording of the webinar, will be available on the Sea Change platform, which you can see at the address on your screen. It's seachangecop.org. So please check the site. We hope to have that information up within the week. And finally, before we close, I'd like to thank Rockefeller Foundation for funding the COP and making this webinar and our COP activities possible. Thanks again, everyone, for your patience as we were navigating this new technology to bring you the webinar today. Thank you for your questions, for your time that you've given us today. For wherever you are in the world, I know it's difficult for some who may be staying up late or up very early to join us today. So we appreciate your support and your participation. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.